Chapter 7. The Little House. Our wedding was just 5 months away, and we still hadn't found anywhere to live. The bedsit was all right for me, but Lesley was used to more comfortable accommodation. One fateful day, I was driving down Clifton Park Avenue, which was just around the corner from 174 Antrim Road. I was on my way to visit my mother to see how she was and to find out if the bereavement counselling was helping, when I noticed building work right beside the peace line, on a small patch of wasteland next to the crumbling premises of the Cat Protection League. A small row of houses was being built under the shadow of the massive wall that surrounded Girdwood Army Barracks and stretched the whole way to the rear of Crumlin Road Prison. This steel-clad, barbed wire-topped monstrosity acted both as a perimeter fence for the British Army base and a peace wall between the Protestants at the Crumlin Road end of Clifton Park Avenue and the Catholics here at the Antrim Road end. Clifton Park Avenue had once been one of the finest streets in Belfast, with beautiful 3- and 4-storey terraced houses inhabited by lawyers who worked in the nearby Crumlin Road courthouse, doctors from the nearby Mater Hospital, and well-heeled business owners and managers. Today, this former tree-lined avenue was mostly waste ground. The middle classes had moved out in droves at the start of the Troubles, and one by one their abandoned houses were burnt to the ground, demolished, or converted into squalid flats. The gaps left behind by the rows of huge townhouses that had been reduced to rubble created a sort of no man's land between the two sections of the community, which suited everybody. When it rained, as it often did, the street looked like a post-apocalyptic scene from a science fiction movie. As well as being in the shadow of the barracks, the building work was also beside a sizable house that was the premises of the Belfast Cat Protection League, known locally as the Cat's Home. Once one of the most prestigious detached Victorian residences of Clifton Park Avenue, it was now really only safe for stray cats. The cats were neither Protestant nor Catholic, so were safer than most residents living on the peace line. Just across the road from the building site and nearest to the Protestant side of the peace line was a solitary terraced house. It looked very odd, just sitting there, all alone. This terraced property had once been only one sliver of a residence in a street full of dozens of terraced houses in a long since demolished community. The house reminded me of a single playing card that was somehow defying the law of physics and still standing after the rest of the house of cards had been removed. On the external walls of the upper floor, you could still see old-fashioned patterned wallpaper from the bedrooms of the houses that had once been attached on either side. The elderly resident of this last house standing had refused to move from his home, while everything around him had been demolished. In front of the house was nothing but waste ground scattered with dumped furniture, rusting car parts, cement blocks, broken glass and crumbling red bricks. A few weeks later, I was driving past the building site again, en route to the Shankill Leisure Centre for a game of squash and a 20p session on a sunbed. This time I noticed a large sign advertising houses for sale in the small development which had been named Brucevale Park. The billboard was so attractive that you would have thought the houses were being built somewhere normal. When I saw this sign, my first thought was, who in their right mind would want to buy a house there? The development was so close to the peace line that it would automatically be a target for sectarian attacks by drunken loyalists on the 11th night, and probably any other night of the year, with or without the motivator of culture celebrations or Buckfast. The little houses would automatically become the first line of defence for the nationalist community along this section of the peace line. In addition, they were located right beside an army base, which could be targeted with an IRA gun or mortar bomb attack at any moment. Sometimes the mortar bombs missed and the neighbouring buildings and their residents were the collateral damage. The IRA sometimes described such death and destruction as regrettable, which was the sort of word I would have used to describe the cancellation of an episode of Doctor Who, rather than the murder of a human being. But for the next few weeks, every time I passed the building site, I was drawn to have a closer look. The small, red, brown brick homes were advertised as townhouses, but had little in common with the grand old townhouses that once lined Clifton Park Avenue. However, they looked fresh and attractive, particularly in contrast to all the old blocked-up houses in the surrounding streets. Priced at £18,500, these luxury homes were available on the co-ownership scheme for people on low incomes. This allowed you to buy half the house with a mortgage from a building society. The scheme bought the other half and then rented it back to you. With each week that passed, I found myself thinking about these new houses more and more. They were in the right location for my work, at the right price for first-time buyers, and much more attractive and habitable than most of the private rental sector properties I'd seen. But who would want to live there? I asked myself. Me, I finally concluded. Us, I wondered, thinking of my wife-to-be. Yes, the INLA graffiti on the wall beside the building site was off-putting. We certainly needed to weigh up the risks of attacks from loyalists and Republicans. But the more I thought and prayed about it, the more I became convinced that this would be the perfect place for us to start our married life. I decided to broach the subject with Lesley. I found us a brand new house in the perfect location, I told Lesley excitedly. My fiancée gave me one of her, "Uh-oh, what's he come up with this time?" looks. Well, it's on the peace line, but it's the perfect location for us, I ventured. Is it nice? Asked Lesley. I think so. Is it safe? I think so. Can we afford it? I think so. The next day, we visited the estate agent and picked up a colour brochure with the plans for the development and the layout of the individual houses. The houses were very small, but big enough for just the two of us. I took Lesley round to the building site to explain how ideal it was and how safe it would be. Lesley didn't say much, which was highly unusual. So at first I was worried that she might hate the idea and we would be back to the drawing board. This was not exactly the sort of place that Lesley had ever imagined living. I knew she wouldn't be put off by the INLA graffiti because Lesley had grown up as one of the minority of Protestants in the South Derry village of Belfast, where the INLA was particularly popular, and her next-door neighbour had been their most famous leader, Dominic McGlinchey. Lesley and I both believed that you sometimes had to take radical steps for peace, but this was going quite far. How many fiancés in their right mind would want to set up a house on Murder Mile? None of the other staff or volunteers of the 174 Trust had ever done anything like this before. Renting in the inner city was unusual enough for people who didn't come from round here, but putting your life savings into a house on the peace line was taking a big gamble. Even the Reverend Taylor himself didn't own the besieged manse he lived in, and he could simply move out when the time came for him to minister in a different church. Well, I know it's probably only for a few years, but if we ever want to move house, no one will want to buy it from us, said Lesley. However, Lesley's main concerns were more about the proximity to the army barracks, the possibility of projectiles being thrown over the peace wall, and the surrounding grim urban dereliction. She had lived in a small rural village for most of her life. The only thing this place had in common with rural South Derry was enthusiasm for the INLA. The artist drawing on the property sale brochure suggested that the new development would look quite attractive, with private parking spaces and a green area with a few trees. The artist's landscape did not include a representation of the desolation just across the road. Clifton Park Avenue looked like a 1940s street in London after the Blitz. I believed there was a possibility that Brucevale Park could become a little oasis on the peace line, and I explained to Lesley that if we bought one of the houses in the back row in the middle, it would be safer. The houses at the end of the row were at risk of being attacked by drunken Protestants who ventured across no man's land with a brick or two. In fact, the windows of the two brand new end terrace houses had been smashed already. The windows were boarded up before the houses were even sold. On the other hand, if angry nationalists ever decided to burn us out for being Protestants living in their community, I figured it would be better to be living in the middle of the row, where we would be harder to find, and from where it would be easier to escape to safety across the peace line to the Protestant side. I had it all worked out. I also thought that the back row was more private and would make our house less of a sitting duck for any passing drunken youth club members who had been barred for sniffing glue in the toilets, even if it was facing the army base. I reassured Lesley that at least the back garden of the Cat's home was between our house and the security wall, and if I were a member of the IRA, I would probably mortar bomb the army barracks from a more strategic position than this one anyway. Lesley wisely suggested we waited until we could have a look inside the house and see how safe it felt before making a decision. In the meantime, I showed the building site to various friends and family members, and the responses ranged from, "Are you sure about this?" to, "You're not near right in the head, wee lad." My mother had other things on her mind and did not object too strongly to our proposed peace line home, although she voiced some concerns about our safety. "You better look after that wee girl if you're going to live over there," was her advice. Lesley's parents travelled down to Belfast to view the house and seemed somewhat cautious, but not strongly opposed to the idea. "I'm surprised they're dead on about you living here," I said. "I thought they'd be horrified, not knowing Belfast and all." "They've no idea," replied Lesley. "It's all just Belfast to them." Of course, Lesley's parents were well aware that once their only child had decided on what she wanted to do, any efforts to dissuade her would be pointless. I was determined, committed and zealous, and no one was going to put me off. I was convinced that once Lesley and I bought a house on the peace line, lots of other committed Christian activists would follow, and this peace movement would ultimately transform the whole area, from segregation to integration and from fear to peace. I was almost certain I was completely right about this. But sometimes from his grave I could hear my father whispering in my ear, "Your head's in cloud bloody cuckoo land, son." Eventually we went for a viewing. As we waited outside in the street, I noticed that from here you could see the top of the imposing granite tower of the Crombie building at Belfast Royal Academy, which was just around the corner on the Cliftonville Road. It struck me that although I was living and working within a few yards of my old school, my life and experiences now felt a million miles away from the protected cocoon of the prestigious grammar school. A few weeks ago, I had contacted the school to warn the headmaster about an incident at the bus stop outside the Saltshaker Centre. I had to distract an angry lad just out of prison who was about to beat up a naive fourth former from BRA who had not taken the school's advice to avoid the bus stops at the top of the New Lodge Road. The schools in North Belfast had an agreement to coordinate the school day so that Protestants and Catholics were less likely to meet each other after school on the streets. In addition, pupils at BRA were advised that the bus stops above the Cliftonville Road were for them, while the bus stops below this junction were for students from St Malachy's. This was all part of our grammar school education. And to be fair, most of the clever children could have passed an 11+ in avoiding the other side. Just as the bespectacled scholar was about to get his head kicked in for being a snobby orange bastard, I intervened with a friendly chat about how welcome the aggressor would be to join the unemployed club at the Saltshaker Centre. "What?" he said. "It's dead on. We can help you with job applications and getting ready for interviews and everything," I explained as the bus arrived and the SWAT boarded to be transported to the safety of Ben Madigan. It didn't take very long to view the house because it was so small. I was relieved that it had a normal doorbell rather than the grating buzzer that had been shredding my nerves for months now at the bedsit. The downstairs was one large room with a bay window looking into the crumbling old red brick perimeter wall of the cat's home. There was space for a fireplace and for a small kitchen that we could choose. Upstairs there was a tiny plastic bathroom and 2 bedrooms overlooking the army barracks. Although, as the barbed wire top of the fencing and the security spotlights were higher than the roof of the house, I suppose the barracks overlooked us. It was hard to tell if anyone was really looking into the bedrooms from the military lookout posts. The bedrooms also had views of the back garden of the cat's home, where dozens of cats were climbing trees, meowing and licking their paws in the shadow of the 50-foot security wall. Outside the house there was a side gate made of black painted wooden panels, a tiny garden, a space for the bin and a coal bunker for the open fire that heated the house. It was a modest little house, but it was brand new and surprisingly bright given that it was so thoroughly overshadowed and surrounded by the architecture of war. I watched Lesley's face as the estate agent showed us around and did his best to explain that this was a safe and improving location where house prices were rising and where there was really very little trouble at all. Aye, dead on, I thought. When the estate agent departed, we stood outside, breathed in the damp air, soaked up the environment and looked around us for a long time. Lesley was uncharacteristically silent. Growing up in a big house in a country village, she wasn't used to having so many neighbours in such close proximity. This community was much closer to my working class roots. I blended in here in my denims, but Lesley was immaculately dressed as usual and looked rather out of place. "Well?" I asked Lesley. She looked around again and again, casting her eyes from the dereliction across the road to the INLA graffiti on the wall behind us, to the security wall of the army barracks in front of us, and back to the modest little house itself. "Well, I could make that wee house lovely," she said with a smile. I knew Lesley could make anywhere lovely just by being there. I was so lucky to be sharing my life with someone who shared my dreams and convictions, and who was even prepared to consider taking this massive step for God, for peace, and for me. "Will we go for it?" I asked. Lesley thought for another while. Finally, she turned to me and took a deep breath. "Oh, my nerves, wee lad, you have no idea," she said, more quietly and calmly than usual. We had decided to buy our little house on the peace line.